Record. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk Mediterranean, the Mediterranean Seminars occasional podcast featuring co-directors Sharon Kinoshita and myself, Brian Catlos. Today, it's our pleasure to welcome Professor Christian Sahner of the Faculty of Oriental Studies at Oxford University, author of Christian Martyrs Under Islam, Religious Violence and the Making of the Muslim World, Princeton 2018, whose article, Zoroastrian Law and the Spread of Islam in Iranian Society, 9th, 10th century, was published earlier this year in the Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies. This was the Mediterranean Seminars September 2021 Article of the Month, and we're happy to have Professor Sahner here with us. So welcome, Christian.
Great, thank you both for having me, and thanks for the distinction of selecting this article as your read of the month.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to the specific topic of the article?
Sure. I guess my own academic training is somewhere between the history of late antiquity and the history of medieval Islam. So long before I came to languages like Arabic and Persian, I had done Latin and Greek. And so in some ways, as a result of that linguistic training and historical training, I became interested in the kinds of topics that would bridge those worlds, that would help us see the way in which the world of late antiquity became the world of medieval Islam. Much of my writing to date has been about early contacts between the early Muslims and the communities that they encountered as they spread across the Near East and other parts of the ancient world. Mostly that has meant Christians. The book that Brian mentioned is a study of some of the earliest contacts between Christians and Muslims in places as varied as Al-Andalus in the West and Iraq in the East. So it was with that general framework in mind, how the late antique world becomes the world of medieval Islam, contacts between different religious groups, that led me to become interested in what I think is fair to say is the great neglected religious community of the early Islamic world, the early Islamic Empire, and these are the Zoroastrians. The Zoroastrians, of course, are adherents of the former state religion of the Sasanian Empire. The Sasanian Empire was the last great Persian empire of antiquity, toppled in the wake of the Arab conquest of the 7th century. And the history of the Zoroastrians, who could be found in Iraq, Iran itself, parts of Central Asia, is relatively invisible in the Islamic period. There's a great amount of attention paid to the history of, say, Jews under early Islamic rule, huge amount of attention paid to early Christians under Islamic rule, but far less attention in the scholarship has been paid to relations between Muslims and the Zoroastrians, who constituted a massive portion of the population, many of those former Sasanian provinces, and indeed a majority in certain places for generations and generations after the Arab conquests. So those were the general questions, the intellectual framework that led me to become interested in this. Near the end of my doctoral studies, I had the good fortune to begin studying the language of Pahlavi. Pahlavi, otherwise known as Zoroastrian Middle Persian, was essentially the official language of the Sasanian Empire in late antiquity, and thereafter it remained the language, the sacred language of the Zoroastrian clergy. So many of our Zoroastrian sources from late antiquity, as well as the early Islamic period, are written in this language. And there's a great wealth of these sources that tend to be read and studied very carefully by specialists in Iranian languages, in Zoroastrian studies, but to my eyes at least are extremely underexploited by people like me who are interested in the rise of Islam, the cosmopolitan empires that were created in the wake of the conquests. So it was that curiosity that led me to study the language, and that's been going on now for, I guess, 7 or 8 years, and I've started to publish the results of my findings, including in the article that you have designated as the article of the month for this month. So that's the wider context for the research and how I got interested in it.
I wonder, Christian, for the benefit of our listeners who haven't had a chance or haven't been able to access the article yet, if you could kind of give us an overview of the article itself, kind of walk us through it, what sources you're using, and what your findings are and what the implications of those are.
So as I mentioned, this is one of a series of publications that have already come out or soon will come out that attempt to read these Zoroastrian sources in Pahlavi against the grain, so to speak, so as to get at the social world of Zoroastrians in the early Islamic period. So some of my research has been on theological texts, some of it on polemical texts. These are legal texts. So the article in question is a study of three important legal sources that are written and redacted during the 9th and the 10th centuries and the high point of Abbasid rule. They are written by highly educated priests sitting in Iraq as well as in Iran, and they belong to a larger genre of legal texts known as responsa. These are not restricted to Zoroastrians. We can find examples of responsa literature among Jews, Christians, Muslims, and other groups at this time. And essentially, they're questions and answers between high-ranking clergy and, in the case of my texts, anonymous petitioners. The petitioner is essentially invisible as an actor in the text, but the priestly legal authority is very visible. The priests are asked a wide range of questions that pertain to theological questions, that pertain to ritual questions, and of great interest to me as someone interested in culture, society, and religion, a lot of nitty-gritty questions about the ways in which Zoroastrians can or should not get on with other religious groups in the mixed society of the 9th and the 10th century. So the article highlights the potential of these texts to tell us something significant about the social history of the Iranian world at this important moment of transition, the early centuries of Islamic rule, and the kinds of flashpoints that arose as a consequence of contact between Zoroastrians and Muslims, things like intermarriage, things like conversion and apostasy, things like inheritance, things like ritual pollution that could be occasioned by contact with religious outsiders. These are the kinds of big themes that come out in these sources and that tell us something significant about the challenges Zoroastrians believe they faced at this time and some of the creative solutions that these priests proposed so as to help their flocks navigate this newly mixed up world.
Great. I wonder if you could give us a sense of the timeline of not just of the responsa that you're working with, but of the conversion to Islam, because as you mentioned, your sources, you said, were from the 9th and 10th century. Of course, the conquest is in the 7th century, and then the move of the caliphal center from Damascus to the more Persianate world in the 8th century. So this speaks to a very long process of acculturation and conversion. So I wonder if there's a sort of just thumbnail social history that you can give us, or that, I mean, I know a lot of this reconstruction must be very difficult and perhaps controversial. But.
Yeah, there's been a huge amount of interest in the story of conversion in the Iranian world in the early Middle Ages, and indeed a huge amount of interest in the story of conversion across the early Islamic Empire. And I'd say that one of my major fields of research is the history of conversion. Along with several colleagues, I co-edited a book that's just come out, which is looking at the history of conversion to Islam in the pre-modern period through the lens of primary sources. So if I may put in a plug for another one of my publications, that one has just come out with the University of California Press. So that's an attempt to put Islamic sources in conversation with Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian sources across a very long time period. But your question, I think, is about the very early period. I think it's safe to say that a much older generation of scholars used to believe that the conquests of the 7th and the 8th centuries ushered in a sweeping and sudden religious change, that the political shift of the conquests led to a very rapid religious shift on the ground. I think it's also safe to say that few scholars follow that narrative today, and by and large, the one that most historians uphold is one of a very slow, rapid, very slow, complex change, one driven by contingency, one that was with high amount of regional variation, in which the experience of groups like the Zoroastrians would have certain parallels with Jews and Christians in other parts of the empire, but would have its own particularities, driven by the Iranian cultural, social context, as well as the particulars of the ways in which Zoroastrianism interacted with Islam. So to answer your question concisely with respect to the Iranian world, the pace of religious change seems to have been fastest in those parts of Iran where Arab settlement occurred most intensively and at the earliest period. And by that, I mean the eastern reaches of the Iranian world. So not the old Sasanian heartlands in Fars province in the southwest, but rather in the eastern reaches of the old Sasanian Empire in a region known as Khorasan, whose capital was the famous city of Marv. And Marv was the seat, was the place where the Abbasid Revolution famously happened. And it was in this environment where you had large-scale Arab tribal settlement, intimate interactions between the Muslim conquerors and settlers and the local Zoroastrian population, along with populations of Buddhists and Christians and others, that conversion seems to have happened the fastest. And interestingly, this is also the region where we see hybrid forms of Islam, where the converts bring many of their old religious beliefs, suppositions into the new Islamic fold. The pace of religious change seems to have been far slower in other areas, including Fars province, which I just mentioned, which incidentally is the source of some of the texts that I studied. We don't really know when such areas probably crossed the threshold of a Muslim demographic majority, but it is certainly not in the Umayyad or the Abbasid period. It probably happens far later, for instance, possibly in the Buyid period, where we find huge political, military investment in those precise regions for the first time. So even as these groups appear to go offline by the standard of Islamic sources, which record a dwindling interest in these communities as time goes on, it is clear that they remain large, vital, and dynamic. And the Pahlavi sources that I study and that I talk about in this article give us a window into that dynamism and the creativity that we find among the Zoroastrian elites of this period.
So yeah, this has been a sort of trend across, I think, across the Islamic world in terms of how historians are reappraising the pace of conversion, to be much slower than had been initially assumed. And one sees this in Al-Andalus, of course, and in Egypt. And I was just wondering, how do your findings and the sort of these revisionist views of the pace of conversion, how do they measure up to Bullitt's monumental, study of his quantitative study of conversion? Do they seem to reinforce Bullitt's curve of conversion, or are they pushing for an even more gradual process? And how is that holding up in terms of the Abbasid lands as a sort of framework for the pace of conversion?
Yeah, I mean, Richard Bullitt's book, which was published in 1979, is a massive, influential, and still important work. It's also much debated and much criticized. I'm sure you'll be familiar with this, and many of your listeners will be too. I mean, my own view is that it's very hard to get at the empirical reality of conversion. I mean, Richard Bullitt deserves great credit for proposing a body of evidence that maybe, possibly, could be manipulated or read in such a way as to give a suggestion of a type of numerical reality on the ground. I think it's debatable whether or not he was successful, and I'm certainly not the first person to say that. I think what is significant and a credit to Bullitt is that it's hard to think of any other kind of evidence that one could, however creatively, read to even get at the kinds of estimates that he put in that book. I want to emphasize that the kind of material that I work on for the history of conversion offers really no hope of getting at a quantitative reality behind this process of religious change. I think what is significant about the material that I have tried to work on and illuminate is that it gets at the experience of religious change. It doesn't necessarily tell us how many Muslims are on the ground, how many Zoroastrians. I think that, as historians, we can give best guesses, not just for the Iranian world, but for lots of other regions. But they, at the end of the day, remain best guesses. That's all you can say. I mean, we don't really have reliable quantitative data for any of these regions until the early modern period, when we start getting censuses, tax registers, the kinds of things that can give us a relative idea of numbers of people in a village or in a region. So just to emphasize that point once again, for me, these are sources that give us a window into the process of religious change, the experience of religious change, how elites reacted to shifts on the ground. They don't really give us an idea of absolutely how many people are around. I mean, my own best guess is that, as you say, the process of religious change is a lot slower. Richard Bullitt, I think for the Iranian world, says it's either something like the 9th or the 10th centuries. I have it in the footnotes of my article, Bullitt's precise wording. Bullitt himself revised his views over time. In, I think, an article from 2005, he said, well, for the Iranian world, I'd want to push it a little bit lower. The kinds of material that he worked on gives you a sense of religious change in urban settings. This is a pre-industrial society in which most of the population is living outside urban environments in the countryside, where by definition the pace of religious change is much slower. So I wouldn't want to hazard a guess as to when this threshold is, when Iran becomes quote unquote an Islamic society, because I think that's something of a fool's errand. But I think that we can certainly speak about the intensifying alarm that conversion provoked among Zoroastrian elites, and the techniques that they use to try and stem the process, or at least regulate it, even if we can't talk about absolute numbers. So I realize I'm kind of dodging your question, but I think it's ultimately impossible to answer unless we get some massive cache of new documents that can give us new kinds of information.
What about other types of sources? For example, in Al-Andalus, one of the ways you can kind of get towards a sense of the pace of conversion is by looking at, the establishment of congregational mosques and the expansion of these, at the expense of Christian churches. Is there anything, is there something similar you can do with Zoroastrianism? I mean, it's something that I'm very interested in, but I know nothing about. So I'm kind of curious as to, as in, say, Al-Andalus or other Islamic lands that were predominantly Christian before the conquest, how does the survival of Zoroastrianism look? Are Zoroastrian temples still functioning? Are they maintained? Do we have any archaeological evidence of them? Epigraphic stuff, going beyond the texts themselves, or I don't know if there are, say, land tenure systems that are particularly associated with Zoroastrianism that maybe we can see surviving and then going into abeyance. What else do we have besides these
Well,
texts?
I should say I'm not an archaeologist, and so I don't want to speak on a subject that I don't know inside and out. My general impression is that the state of so-called Islamic archaeology in Iran is not nearly as developed as the parallel field in a place like Egypt or Greater Syria. And that's a great point of frustration for people that want to look at questions like this. When do fire temples fall out of disuse? At what point are they converted into mosques? I mean, there are plenty of records of the conversion of Zoroastrian sacred sites into mosques in textual sources of the period. Lots and lots of them. And there's been good work done on this. What my impression is that we don't nearly have as rich a picture of what the material evidence tells us about the same process. So, you mentioned the expansion of congregational mosques in Al-Andalus, and I think what you might be alluding to, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, is the gradual expansion of a site like the Umayyad Mosque in Cordoba, whose increasing footprint over the course of the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries may tell us something significant about the growing size of the Muslim population of that capital city. I don't think that we have that kind of evidence for the Iranian world. I stand to be corrected, but I certainly have not come across it. Some of the most interesting evidence, it's not quite archaeological, but it's documentary evidence, has come from the region of Tabaristan. And this is the mountainous region in the north of Iran, where Zoroastrian princely dynasties that trace their ancestry back to the Sasanian period continued deep into the Islamic period. It was a region whose geography enabled its local elites to resist direct conquest for much longer than other parts of the old Sasanian world. In the past few years, there's been a concerted effort to study and make sense of Pahlavi legal documents from Tabaristan that were discovered in the past few years, which make clear that not only are these communities large and vital long after the time of the conquest of the rest of the Iranian world, but that they keep on doing things according to basically Zoroastrian legal customs, and that there are certain significant parallels between the types of judicial procedures we see reflected in these Pahlavi documents of the 8th century and what we can piece together about how law, the Sasanian legal regime looked in late antiquity. So again, not archaeology, but material evidence that shows the vitality of these communities for generations and generations after the Sasanian Empire falls elsewhere. So I'd say that's a real growth area. That's a place to look if you're interested in this question.
I wanted to ask about, you mentioned at the beginning your work in looking at conversion rates from other religions at the beginning of the Islamic period. And on the one hand, the specificity of Zoroastrianism is, for example, that Zoroastrians would not have counted as peoples of the book, I guess. So the conditions of being a dhimmi would have been separate from Christians and Jews. But on the other hand, in your article, you talk about responsa as a form that's found across various religions. So I wonder if you have impressions or maybe something more concrete about this kind of overlap of a legal genre and practice, especially in the way it relates to everyday social practices versus the kinds of splits in the ways that communities of different religions are regarded.
Yeah, I mean, responsa, as I mentioned, otherwise known as questions and answers, it is a genre that we find among all sorts of different communities. And, in some cases, if one is a specialist in, say, Syriac and is interested in the history of the Syriac-speaking churches in the early Islamic period, there are all sorts of sources that can tell you a huge amount about the changes that those communities experienced in the early centuries of Islamic rule. In the form of chronicles, in the form of legal texts, responsa, theological texts. We don't really have that sort of evidence, that such a broad range of evidence on the Zoroastrian side, or at least such a broad range of evidence that speaks explicitly about the themes of religious change, social conflict, etc. And so I think that when I think about what we can do with these sources versus what people have done in the study of, say, Christianity or Judaism, I mean, basically, we don't have a lot else to fall back on when we study the social history of Zoroastrianism in the early Islamic period. So these sources have real pride of place for figuring out these nitty-gritty issues of intermarriage, coexistence between quotation marks, that sort of stuff, in a way that has been done on the Christian or the Jewish side, but can also be supplemented with a range of narrative sources, material evidence, theological evidence. So that's something that I think is a distinction. Just the availability of other kinds of evidence from authors of the period. Now, I think one of the big points that I try to make in the article is that, especially when it comes to the Zoroastrians and also the Christians, the Jews are a slightly separate case, is that we were talking about communities who were heirs to imperial traditions in late antiquity, who saw their imperial power, the royal power dwindle overnight. It's not to say that they were politically disempowered. It was just that they were no longer the privileged class that presided over great empires as Christians did in the Byzantine world or as Zoroastrians had done in the Sasanian world. And so in those places, Christianity was the law of the realm, not merely in matters of specific religious interest, what we might call private law, the manner in which religion regulates things like marriage and inheritance and the rest, but Christianity dictated, or at least had an influence in the ways in which the affairs of the empire were run in all sorts of ways that we might call secular, again, between quotation marks. The same applies for the Zoroastrians. And I think what is significant about this responsive literature from the early Islamic period, especially when we look at the Christian and the Zoroastrian text, we're looking at communities that are essentially trying to solve a common dilemma. They are post-imperial religions that now need to rewrite their laws to reflect the unfortunate reality, from their point of view, that they're no longer the big cheese. They're no longer in a position to legislate about matters like taxation. They're no longer in a position to legislate about matters like capital punishment, really. But the legal authority of the elites has now shrunken down to matters of largely internal or private concern. Again, issues such as inheritance, contact with religious outsiders, commerce, marriage, the rearing and custody of children. And so in the article, I talk about, there's a legal identity that's thrust upon these groups by their Muslim rulers. They don't label themselves dhimmis, at least in the first instance. But faced with this legal reality, they then need to come up with a legal framework of their own to match this new identity. And I think what is interesting about these responsa texts is that we can see in real time an attempt to basically reflect that new identity and to carve out a sphere of authority under the law that the Muslims did not wish to regulate, could not regulate, but which these priests definitely could. So I think it's the proactive adoption of the dhimmi identity that we see reflected in these texts. And again, this I'm echoing some recent research that's been done on Christian sources of the period. And here just to plug an excellent book by my colleague Lev Weitz, who studied marriage and family law among East Syrian Christians, and many of his conclusions for those sources, written in languages such as Syriac and Arabic, mirrors what I have found for the Pahlavi sources on the Zoroastrian side.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I guess part of my question was meant to be a kind of genealogy of the responsa, and if there are Sasanian era examples of responsa and what we can say. I mean, Brian for the Mediterranean has coined the concept of mutual intelligibility. So I'm wondering to what extent responsa participates in a kind of West Asian, mutual intelligibility or common practices among different religions.
Yeah, I mean, question and answers, debate literature, which is a cousin of what we're talking about. These are all genres of texts that we find going back not just into late antiquity, but to far more distant antiquity, and upon which these authors, Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian, are drawing. The problem for Zoroastrianism is that we assume that there were significant legal texts in the pre-Islamic period. We assume that these legal texts had an important influence on works that were written and redacted after the conquests, but it can often be difficult to figure out precisely what these texts look like. The most important Sasanian era legal text is something called the Book of 1,000 Judgments, which will be well known to specialists in Zoroastrianism or in Sasanian studies. And this is a work that I reference in the course of my article. It's an incredibly rich text. It gives you a sense of Zoroastrianism not merely as a religion, but as an imperial force endowed with legal authority, custodian of an empire as much as a religious faith. But that text is unique. And so one way of measuring the changes that the Zoroastrians experienced after the conquest is to line up a text like the Book of 1,000 Judgments with the Islamic era text that I attempted to analyze in the article, and to see what are the kind of themes, what are the range of themes that these authors who have similar kinds of titles, they're high-ranking priests. The priests of the Islamic period looked upon the priests of the Sasanian period as their forebears. They often quoted them. But we can see that in the 9th and the 10th centuries, they're laying claim to a far more limited sphere of authority than their counterparts had done before the conquests. So I don't know if that gets at the question of genealogy, but that certainly gets at, I think, some of the signal changes that this community experiences as you go from, say, the 6th or the early 7th century until the 9th or the 10th.
I had a broader question, but I want to just keep on the responsa for a moment. I was wondering, sometimes responsa are answers to real life questions that are being posed, but other times, and this is the case I think often with fatwas, that they're hypothetical situations. And so I'm wondering to what extent you can see whether these responsa, these Zoroastrian responsa, are responses to the constituency of these priests, or whether this is a sort of a manifestation of an internal dialogue that they're having as they grapple with their new status and readjust their expectations regarding the role of Zoroastrianism in the world.
Yeah, exactly. Well, anyone who has looked at responsa, regardless of the language of the source or the community in which it originates, will have to reckon with this question. Responsa give tantalizing hints of social realities, but so often they are the product of scholastic circles where the authors give the impression that they're more interested in arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin than they are with solving a real social dilemma. And so this problem is common to all genres of responsive literature, not just Zoroastrian. but it is particularly acute in the case of the sources that I work in. Indeed, I try to deal with this big methodological question in a chunky section at the beginning of the article, essentially a guide to reading these sources, in which I lay out the possibilities that they offer as well as some of their significant limitations. And you've put your finger on the biggest one. I mean, my general impression is that a lot of the questions, even if we don't know precisely where they come from, we don't know the names of the questioners. Questioners, are anonymous characters in these texts, and in this sense, the Zoroastrian responsa look different from, say, the Gaonic responsa that Jews are producing around the same time. Gaonic responsa, very often we have names of petitioners, we have names of respondents. Even if they have a scholastic quality to them, sometimes we can track the disseminations of these answers in documentary sources. We have nothing like this on the Zoroastrian side. We're basically left with a text that is allegedly written or redacted in the 9th or the 10th centuries, but is surviving in a manuscript from the 16th, the 17th centuries, from India, incidentally. And that's maybe a separate part of the Zoroastrian story that we can talk about later if you're interested in. But there are all sorts of layers and all sorts of scrubbings that take place that have conditioned our information, that put a distance between us as the reader and the social reality to which they allegedly answer. So to try and answer your question as concisely as possible, I think when I read these sources that the kinds of questions that are posed look a whole lot like real social dilemmas. The kinds of issues that I've now mentioned several times: conversion, apostasy, intermarriage, inheritance, what to do if your business partner is from outside the Zoroastrian fold. These questions that head the responsa look a whole lot like real social realities. As to whether the answers from the priests bear any resemblance to a social reality, that is a completely separate question. So there's a certain earthiness, there's a certain concreteness to the questions themselves, and more often than not, the answers have this rambling, abstract, theoretical, scholastic quality, in which it seems that the author, the compiler, is basically showing off his intellectual worth, showing his mastery of the tradition, his knowledge of all sorts of exceptions and contingencies that could change his answer to the question. So with that in mind, you have to kind of read the sources at two different levels. As the historian, I find the questions much more useful, the answers often less revealing.
Great. So now let me pull back and kind of ask a larger contextual question that, in fact, you've started to answer, but just to sort of highlight it. So, it seems to me that the Zoroastrians are a really potentially interesting counterexample or test case for some of the generalities that we have developed when we're thinking about the place of dhimmis in Islamic society. So I'm just wondering, what does the study of this community, such to the extent that we can get at them, how does that nuance our understanding of dhimma vis-a-vis the sorts of dynamics we've observed with Muslims and Jews across the Islamic world? And the second part of the question, I realize this is probably a lot already. What evidence, if any, do we have of, say, Zoroastrian Jewish or Zoroastrian Christian relations in that Abbasid world, relations between this minority and the other minorities? And I realize that the answer may be nothing, but I'm interested in knowing.
Yeah. Well, if I may first sort of challenge the premise of the question, or rather challenge one of the last things you said, which was to look upon these communities as minorities. And minority, as you know better than anyone, is a notoriously problematic term. But when we take it at face value, we're talking about numbers, right? And one of the points that I constantly try to convey to my students, and I try to tease out in my writings, is that when we're talking about these non-Muslim communities, certainly at an early point, like the 9th or the 10th centuries, I don't think we're talking about minorities.
Yeah. No, let me just interject. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. I don't necessarily, for me, the important sense in which I usually use the term isn't in a numerical sense, but in the sense of their sort of their place in the juridical hierarchy.
Political minorities.
Yeah, exactly. Or ethno-religious, in the sense that they have less potency, less hegemony within the sort of the structure of society.
No, of course. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, Brian. It's your right to put me on the spot. I'm the one being interviewed, but I raise it because I think that I think it's you know, I think it's a term that we have to use with a great amount of nuance. And I think that one of the, you know, I think that early Islamic society, whether we're talking about the Jews, the Christians, the Zoroastrians, or any number of other groups, looks a whole lot different if we park the assumption that they are a minority, whether we're talking about demographic minorities or indeed even political minorities. There, I think the term can be used much more legitimately in the way that you use it. But I think that if we want to understand the ways in which the response of these communities to the rise of Islam could be dynamic, could be assertive, the way in which these communities continue to have centers of gravity that did not depend on a Muslim legal system or Muslim rule, that they were not purely accommodating themselves to terms imposed on them by the outside, but indeed could assert themselves on their own. I think it requires kind of often not using language like minority, or at least qualifying it again in the way that you have done. So for me, you know, what's the big insight here about, say, the Dhimmi regime, insofar as the Dhimmi regime mattered to anyone in, say, an Iranian village in the 9th or the 10th centuries? You know, I think it shows the ways in which a legal category like belonging to the Al-Dhimma, the protected people, was a category that was not only kind of imposed from without, but was also kind of constructed and fashioned from within. This was something that I tried to explain a few minutes ago, I think, in response to one of Sharon's questions, that you know, you're told you're a dhimmi. It comes with some, you know, concrete definitions and criteria, but it's really up to you to notify the world how you intend to live out your life as a dhimmi. And I think that in the 3 texts that I study in the article, we have 3 examples of or 3 attempts to sort of answer that question in a proactive and creative way. So that was the first thing. And your second question, Brian, remind me.
What evidence, if any, do we see of relations between Zoroastrians and
Yes.
other less privileged groups within Abbasid society, say Christians and Jews, not to use the M word?
Yeah, sorry about that. Well, I mean, you know, much as Zoroastrians don't disappear overnight, you know, none of these other groups do. And, you know, the Sasanian Empire may have had an official religion in the form of Zoroastrianism, but much as the early Islamic Empire is multi-confessional, cosmopolitan, the Sasanian Empire was too. And these groups continue to exist in Iranian society after the conquests. I mean, one text that I'm working on at the moment that's really fascinating is a work known as the Shkan Gumani Guizar. And this is a text that is probably written in the 9th or 10th centuries, perhaps in Baghdad. And it is the most important Zoroastrian polemical treatise of the tradition, full stop. What is unique about it is that it's written in a style that closely resembles Kalam, dialectical theology that was then extremely popular among Muslims and growing numbers of non-Muslims. And what's fascinating about the work, and why I mentioned it in reference to your question, is that it contains a series of chapters in which the Zoroastrian author, who was a layman, not a priest, an interesting point in and of itself, attempts to dismantle the beliefs of Muslims, then Jews, then Christians, and then he ends with the Manichaeans. So in this sense, it looks a whole lot like the heresiographical or doxographical treatises that Muslims are producing around the same time, in which they use the techniques of kalam, dialectical rationalist theology, to oppose the beliefs of their main religious competitors. So we can see it in a sense as an extension of the kinds of religious debates that Zoroastrians had been engaged in the late antique period, but which remained salient deep into the Islamic period. You know, Muslims were the new, guerrilla on the street. They were the ones who needed to be opposed and challenged. But these other groups didn't disappear. And so, I'm focusing on the Islamic chapters of the Shkand, which are largely unstudied. But there are incredible and fascinating arguments in that text against Judaism, Christianity, and Manichaeism that seem to suggest that the author has a very deep knowledge of those traditions, their scriptures, their beliefs, and how he retools the Zoroastrian tradition to basically oppose them. So the conquests are a massive rupture, but in some ways there's a massive continuity in intellectual and religious life across that frontier. in which the conquests look much more like a blip than they do some massive change.
So before we conclude, a few minutes ago, you mentioned the transmission of some of these sources to later centuries and in India, and I wonder if you could just say a couple words.
Yeah, so so Zoroastrians in Iran today represent a tiny, tiny portion of the population. They are still an important part of Iranian society. They are still found in places like Yazd, which is a historic Zoroastrian center across many centuries. They can be found in Tehran, the modern capital of Iran. But Zoroastrians have dwindled to very, very small numbers in their own historic heartlands. Where you will find Zoroastrians in larger numbers is in India, where they're known as Parsis. And the story of how Zoroastrianism moved from the Iranian world to India actually probably predates the rise of Islam. There are probably political connections, economic connections between Zoroastrians in the Sasanian world and India that first brought the religion there. But at least according to the narrative that the Parsi community tells about itself, it was as a result of the alleged deprivations imposed by the conquests, the gradual conversion of Iranian society, the persecution that they faced, that led larger and larger numbers of Zoroastrians to abandon their traditional heartlands and to go to India. So in terms of the history of Zoroastrian texts, this is interesting because most of our Pahlavi sources, like the ones that I'm working on, even if they are assumed to have been written or redacted in somewhere like Iraq or Iran in the early medieval period, the vast majority of these sources survive in the form of late medieval, early modern Indian manuscripts. So I mentioned it earlier in the context of the transmission of these texts, the extent to which we can trust them, the extent to which we should be alive and sensitive to changes that they experience as they moved from the Iranian world to the subcontinent. But that afterlife, the vitality of Zoroastrianism in the Indian world is in and of itself fascinating. And at least for me, I feel like when I read these texts, I have to read them at three historical levels. I have to read them with an eye to the Sasanian religious and intellectual tradition that informed the texts. You have to read them with an eye to the early Islamic environment in which they were written, redacted, in which they were formed. And that's where I think my value add is as a historian of early Islamic society. And then you have to read them with an eye to the early modern Indian world in which the material remains in the text, the manuscripts are produced and preserved. And that requires a huge amount, that's intellectual gymnastics. I'm not saying I'm particularly good at it, but these texts are not frozen in time and they belong to very, very different worlds. And the more we can be aware of those contexts, I think the better we can understand them.
Okay, well, our time is drawing to a close, but before we wrap things up, I did want to ask you one little thing, and that is you started to plug the book that was coming out with the University of California Press, but I don't think you said the title. What's the name of the book?
The book is out. Thank you for the plug. The book is out. It's called Conversion to Islam in the Pre-Modern Age, a source book. It is a collaboration between me and my colleagues Luke Yarbrough at UCLA, Ori Simonson at Haifa, and Nimrod Horvitz at Ben Gurion University in the Negev. And we have primary sources in translation from about 50 or 60 contributors, lots of different languages, lots of different geographical contexts. I have been piloting these sources in my own teaching here at Oxford, and I think the students really like them. So we hope that it will be a great stimulus to teaching on the subject of conversion, and hopefully downstream of teaching, maybe research. So check it out.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic, and I'm definitely gonna look for that. Well, with that, I think we're going to close. Once again, this has been Let's Talk Mediterranean. I'm Brian Catlos, and with me is Sharon Kinoshita. We're the co-directors of the Mediterranean Seminar, and today our guest was Professor Christian Sahner from Oriental Studies at Oxford University, and we were discussing his article, Zoroastrian Law and the Spread of Islam in Iranian Society, 9th and 10th century. So once again, thanks so much for joining us, Christian. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and we're looking forward to seeing your work going forward.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian and Sharon.
Okay, take care.